The pack brought their fiercest warriors. The human mechanic brought sandwiches. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. In the dim maintenance bay of Frontier Station 7, surrounded by the constant hum of failing life support systems and the acrid smell of burnt wiring, Blake Turner wiped grease from his hands onto his already stained coveralls and stared at the impossible repair schedule on his datapad. He had 16 hours to fix systems that should take 60, no backup, no relief crew, and a station full of dignitaries who would arrive in less than a day for the most important diplomatic summit in galactic history. Little did he know that his toolbox and lunch cooler would soon become the most critical assets in preventing an interstellar war. The message had come through 3 days ago, marked with the highest priority encryption Blake had ever seen on a civilian station. The Krenthi Pack, the most feared warrior culture in the known galaxy, would be meeting with the coalition of free worlds to negotiate their first peace treaty in over 200 years. Frontier Station 7, positioned in neutral space, had been chosen as the meeting ground. The station commander, a nervous Velfrin administrator named Orcs, had nearly collapsed when he read the guest list. Blake had been the only human on the station for the past 8 months, ever since the last crew rotation got delayed due to shipping lane conflicts. He had grown used to the solitude, to the peculiar looks from the various alien species that cycled through the station, to being the only representative of humanity in this small corner of space. Most species found humans oddly fascinating, though they could never quite articulate why. The Velfrans thought humans were too soft, too willing to help. The Kortathi found their persistence unsettling. The Brentali just thought they were weird. Now, as Blake stood in the guts of the station's environmental systems, tracing a fault in the tertiary cooling network, he could hear the commotion several decks above. The coalition delegation had arrived early, and from the sound of the multiple footsteps and agitated voices echoing through the ventilation shafts, they were not happy with the accommodations. His communicator chirped. It was Orcs, and the administrator sounded like he was on the verge of a breakdown. Blake answered. The administrator's voice came through in a rush. Commander Orcs explained that the Krenthi were arriving in 6 hours instead of 16. Their warship had just dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge, and the coalition delegates were already making demands about security protocols, and half the environmental systems were reading critical failures. And why had Blake not fixed everything yet? Blake took a slow breath, the kind he had learned to take when everything was on fire and people were yelling. He replied calmly that he was one person. The station needed a crew of at least 8 maintenance techs for proper operations, and he was doing the best he could, but he could not work miracles. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Orcs said something that Blake had heard too many times in his career, spoken in a tone of desperate hope mixed with the particular kind of expectation that only came from not understanding how complex systems actually worked. The administrator said he had heard humans were good at miracles. Blake closed his eyes and counted to 5. He told Orcs he would do what he could, then ended the call before the administrator could add anything else to the list of impossibilities. The thing was, Blake actually understood where that weird expectation came from. Humans had a reputation in the galaxy, one that had developed over the 70 years since first contact. They were the species that had gone from chemical rockets to faster-than-light travel in less than a century. They were the ones who looked at problems that stumped civilizations thousands of years older and asked innocent questions that somehow led to breakthroughs. They were the species that had introduced the entire galaxy to the concept of duct tape, and then used it to repair a colony ship's hull breach in deep space, a fix that held for 3 years until proper repairs could be made. But Blake was not a miracle worker. He was a mechanic. A good one, sure, but still just a guy with tools and training and a really long list of broken things to fix. He made his way through the station's maintenance tunnels, a network of cramped corridors that ran behind the walls of the main areas. He had spent enough time in these passages that he could navigate them in the dark. Right now, he was headed for the main environmental control hub, where he could at least get the atmospheric processors stabilized before the Krenthi arrived. The Krenthi. Blake had read about them, of course. Everyone had. They were the species that had fought the entire coalition to a standstill 30 years ago, a war that ended not because either side won, but because both sides ran out of resources to continue. They were tall, covered in thick fur that ranged from deep black to silvery gray, with powerful builds and eyes that could see in spectrums humans could not. They organized themselves in packs, complex social hierarchies built around strength, honor, and a concept they called the hunt, which seemed to encompass everything from actual hunting to warfare to business negotiations. They respected strength above all else. They had no patience for weakness or deception, and they were bringing their finest warriors to this negotiation, which Blake suspected was their way of saying they were taking this seriously, while also making sure everyone knew they could turn the whole station into scrap if things went wrong. Blake reached the environmental hub and opened the access panel. The mess inside made him wince. Someone, probably during the station's initial construction, had decided to save time by bundling the control circuits too tightly. Over years of thermal cycling, the insulation had degraded, and now he was looking at what was essentially a rat's nest of partial shorts and heat damage. He got to work, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Pull the damaged sections, reroute through backup conduits, replace the burnt-out controller boards, rebalance the load. It was meditative in its way, this kind of work. There was a right way to do it, and if you did it right, things worked. No politics, no posturing, just cause and effect. 3 hours later, he had the environmental system stable. Not perfect, but they would hold. The atmospheric mix would stay breathable, the temperature would remain comfortable for most species, and the waste recycling would not back up and create an incident that nobody wanted to think about. He was about to move on to the power distribution issues when his communicator chirped again. This time it was not Orcs. The voice that came through was deep and resonant, with an odd harmonic quality that suggested it came from a throat not shaped quite like a human's. The voice identified itself as Security Chief Mordax of the Coalition delegation. The chief asked where Blake was and stated that they needed to meet immediately regarding security protocols for the Krenthi arrival. Blake replied that he was in environmental control, that he was in the middle of critical repairs, and asked if this could wait. The response was immediate and sharp. Chief Mordax stated no, it could not wait, and that Blake needed to come to the main conference room immediately, and that this was not a request. Blake looked at his tool bag, at the half-completed checklist on his datapad, at the tangle of power conduits he still needed to address. Then he looked at his watch. The Krenthi would be here in less than 3 hours. He made his way to the conference room, still in his grease-stained coveralls, tool belt hanging from his waist. The looks he got from the Coalition delegates when he walked in ranged from confusion to barely concealed disdain. Security Chief Mordax turned out to be a Kortathi, a species that looked vaguely like someone had crossed a bear with a lizard and then made the result 7 feet tall. His scales were a deep bronze color, and his eyes were the yellow of old amber. He looked at Blake the way someone might look at a stain on an expensive carpet. Chief Mordax asked if Blake was the human. Blake confirmed he was, and asked what this was about. The Kortathi's tail twitched, a gesture Blake had learned meant irritation. The chief explained that they had been reviewing the station's security measures and found them completely inadequate for an event of this magnitude, that the Krenthi pack would arrive with their honor guard, their finest warriors, and the station had exactly one security officer, a Velthrin who looked like he might faint at a loud noise, and they needed to know what defensive capabilities Blake could provide. Blake blinked. He said he was a mechanic, not security, and his defensive capabilities consisted of a welding torch and a really heavy wrench. The room went quiet. Several delegates exchanged glances. A Brentali representative, her crystalline features catching the light in prismatic patterns, spoke up. She explained that they were told humans were warriors, that human military forces had helped end the scattering wars, that humans had a reputation for being, and here she paused, as if searching for the right word, formidable. Blake felt a headache building behind his eyes. He told them that yes, humans could fight, humanity had a military, but he was not military. He fixed air conditioners and power converters, and if they wanted security, they should have brought security. Chief Mordax's scales darkened, another sign of Kortathi agitation. The chief stated that they did bring security, 12 armed guards, but the Krenthi were bringing their honor guard, and a Krenthi honor guard could tear through 12 regular soldiers like paper. and they had assumed that having a human on station meant they had someone who could. And here, he gestured vaguely, even things out. Blake stared at the security chief, then at the assembled delegates. Then he started laughing. He could not help it. The absurdity of the situation, the weight of their expectations, the sheer ridiculousness of thinking that one mechanic was some kind of secret weapon, it all hit him at once. The laughter died when he saw their faces. They were not joking. They actually believed this. Blake took a breath and explained as clearly as he could. He told them he understood humans had a certain reputation, but that reputation came from specific contexts, that yes, humans were persistent and creative and had done some impressive things, but he personally was just trying to keep the station from falling apart. And he had maybe 2 hours of work left before the Crinthi arrived. And could he please go do that so everyone did not suffocate or freeze? There was a long silence. Finally, a Velthran diplomat, smaller than Orcs, but with more elaborate head crests, spoke in a quiet voice. She said they understood, that they had perhaps placed unfair expectations on Blake, but they were frightened, and the Crinthi were frightening, and they had hoped. Well, they had hoped for a miracle. Blake felt his irritation drain away. These were not warriors or strategists. They were diplomats, administrators, people who spent their lives in negotiations and compromises. And they were scared. He told them softly that he would do what he could, but right now, what he could do was make sure the station did not kill everyone before negotiations even started, and that had to be enough. As he left the conference room, Blake heard one of the delegates mutter something about human humility being another unexpected trait. He was not sure if that was a compliment or another unrealistic expectation to add to the pile. Back in the maintenance corridors, Blake worked with renewed focus. Power distribution, check. Gravity generators, balanced. Communications array, optimized. He moved through the station's systems like a surgeon, finding problems and fixing them, or at least patching them well enough to last through the summit. With 40 minutes to spare before the Crinthi arrival, Blake finally allowed himself to stop. He was exhausted, covered in various types of grease and coolant, and hungry enough that his stomach was staging a protest. He made his way to his small quarters, a cramped room barely large enough for a bed and a tiny food preparation area. He had missed lunch, and dinner, and probably several other meals. His emergency rations were depleted from the last long repair session, but in his small cooling unit, he found the ingredients he had been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to come. Fresh bread from the last supply ship, real tomatoes grown in the station's small hydroponics bay, actual cheese from a trader who specialized in human foods, and some kind of deli meat that was close enough to turkey. Blake made sandwiches. 4 of them, because he was that hungry. He wrapped 2 in preservation film for later, took a bite of the first one, and nearly cried at how good simple food could taste when you were this tired. His communicator chirped. The Crinthi had arrived. Blake grabbed his sandwiches, figured he could eat on the way, and headed for the main docking bay. He was not supposed to be there. He had no official role in the welcoming ceremony, but he wanted to see the environmental systems perform under the stress of the docking process, and that was easier to monitor from the bay's control room. The docking bay was massive, large enough to accommodate 3 frigates simultaneously. Right now, it held the Coalition's transport and a lot of nervous people in formal attire. Blake slipped into the control room, which overlooked the bay from behind reinforced glass, and pulled up the system monitors while eating his sandwich. The Crinthi ship was unlike anything Blake had seen before. It was not elegant like Velthran designs or geometric like Kortathi vessels. It looked like someone had taken the concept of a predator and turned it into a spacecraft. All angles and aggression, with weapon ports that did not even pretend to be anything else. The ship docked with surprising gentleness. The airlock cycled, and then the Crinthi emerged. They were bigger than Blake had imagined. The shortest of them had to be at least 7.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough that they had to turn slightly to fit through the airlock. Their fur was primarily dark gray, with patterns that Blake suspected had cultural significance. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for creatures that large, like watching tigers walk on their hind legs. At the front was clearly the pack leader. Her fur was almost black, shot through with silver that caught the light, and she carried herself with an authority that needed no announcement. Behind her came the honor guard, 6 warriors who looked like they could tear a bulkhead apart with their bare hands. The coalition delegation stepped forward, led by the small Velfrin diplomat from earlier. She began the formal greetings, her voice steady despite the fact that she barely came up to the pack leader's waist. Blake watched from the control room, monitoring the systems, taking another bite of his sandwich. Everything was holding. The atmospheric processors were handling the additional load. The gravity was stable. The docking clamps were secure. He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Then alarms started blaring. Blake's eyes shot to the monitors. One of the primary power conduits, one he had not had time to check, was showing a critical overload. The additional draw from the Krenthi ship's systems integration was pushing it past tolerance. He had maybe 30 seconds before it blew, and if it blew, it would take out power to half the station, including life support for the guest quarters. He did not think. He ran. The conduit access was 2 decks down and halfway across the station. Blake sprinted through corridors, his tool belt banging against his hip, still clutching his half-eaten sandwich because his brain had not caught up enough to tell him to drop it. He reached the access panel, yanked it open, and was hit by a wave of heat that spoke of imminent catastrophic failure. The conduit was glowing. Literally glowing. The metal taking on a cherry red color that meant the insulation inside was already burning. He had seconds, not minutes. Blake grabbed the emergency cutoff, a manual lever that required about 100 pounds of force to activate. It was designed for species stronger than humans. He grabbed it with both hands, planted his feet, and pulled with everything he had. The lever did not move. Blake swore, readjusted his grip, and tried again. His shoulders screamed in protest. The lever shifted slightly. Not enough. He looked around desperately. His eyes landed on his tool belt. Specifically, on the 3-foot-long torque multiplier he used for stuck bolts. It was basically a pipe with a ratchet mechanism, designed to give mechanical advantage. Blake hooked the multiplier onto the lever, braced himself against the wall, and pulled. The lever moved. Slowly, fighting him every inch, but it moved. The glowing conduit began to dim as the power flow cut off, rerouting to backup systems. Blake held the lever until it locked into the emergency position, then collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. His sandwich had somehow survived, still clutched in one hand. He looked at it, looked at the smoking conduit access, and started laughing again. A voice spoke behind him, deep and resonant and definitely not human. The voice asked what Blake had done. Blake turned. Standing in the corridor was one of the Krenthi honor guard. Up close, she was even more impressive, easily 8 feet tall, with scars visible through her fur and eyes that seemed to see right through him. She was looking at him with an expression Blake could not quite read. He explained that there had been a power overload, and he had to cut it off manually before it took out half the station. The warrior stepped closer, examining the still smoking access panel. She asked if Blake had pulled that lever, stating she could smell the metal stress and see the heat damage, and asking if he knew that lever required significant force to operate. Blake said he did now, and that his shoulders would probably remind him for a few days. The Krenthi made a sound that might have been a laugh. She introduced herself as Kessa, Shield of the Pack, and stated that she had come to investigate the alarm, but it seemed Blake had already resolved the crisis. Blake shrugged, trying not to wince at how much his shoulders hurt. He said it was his job, and someone had to keep the station running. Kessa tilted her head, studying him. She noted that Blake was the human mechanic she had been told about, and asked what he was holding. Blake looked down at his sandwich. He said it was his dinner, and that he had not had time to eat today. There was a pause. Then Kessa said something in a language Blake did not know, but her tone suggested surprise. She switched back to the common tongue and stated that Blake had interrupted his meal to prevent a catastrophic failure. Blake replied that when he put it like that it sounded more dramatic than it was, and that really he had just been doing his job. Kessa made that laughing sound again. She said humans were strange, and that she had heard stories but had not believed them, and now she was beginning to think the stories were not strange enough. Before Blake could figure out how to respond to that, his communicator chirped. It was Orcs, panicking again. The administrator reported that the power fluctuation had been noticed, that the coalition delegation was demanding explanations, and that the Krenthi pack leader was asking questions. And did Blake know what happened? Blake reported that he had handled it, that there was a conduit overload, but it was now isolated and running on backups, and that he would have a full repair completed in about an hour. Orcs sounded like he might cry with relief. The administrator thanked Blake, said he was a miracle worker, and promised to include this in his commendation report. Blake ended the call and found Kessa still watching him with that unreadable expression. She said that she would report to the pack leader that the situation was under control and that Blake had demonstrated proper behavior in a crisis. Then she paused and added that if Blake was going to repair the damage, she would accompany him, as it seemed like events occurred around him that might require a warrior's presence. Blake was not sure if that was a compliment, a threat, or just an observation, but he nodded and got to work on the conduit repair. Kessa stood watch, her presence both intimidating and oddly comforting. She asked questions as he worked, genuinely curious about what he was doing. Blake found himself explaining the principles of power distribution, thermal management, and why the original installation had been done wrong. Kessa listened intently. At one point, she observed that maintaining a station's systems was not unlike maintaining a pack's territory, that both required constant attention, understanding of complex interconnected systems, and the ability to respond quickly to threats. Blake had never thought of it that way, but she was right. He said as much, and Kessa made an approving sound. The repair took 2 hours, not 1. By the time Blake finished, the formal reception had ended, and the station had settled into an uneasy quiet. The Coalition and the Krenthi were in their respective quarters, probably preparing for the actual negotiations that would begin in the morning. Blake was exhausted. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours straight, and his body was reminding him of every one of them. Kessa walked with him back to the main level, still asking occasional questions about the station's systems. When they reached a junction where their paths diverged, she stopped. She told Blake that she would inform the pack leader of his competence, that it was rare to meet someone who took their responsibilities so seriously, and that the Krenthi valued such dedication. Then she added something that made Blake pause. She said that many species seemed to think strength was only about fighting, but the Krenthi knew better, and that keeping people alive and safe required its own kind of strength, one that Blake clearly possessed. Blake did not know what to say to that. He settled for a simple thank you, and Kessa nodded before heading toward the Krenthi quarters. Back in his own small room, Blake collapsed onto his bed, too tired to even remove his boots. He managed to eat one of the sandwiches he had saved, the simple food tasting like the best thing in the universe, and then sleep claimed him. He woke 6 hours later to more alarms. This time, it was the water reclamation system. A valve had failed in the night, and one of the main recycling tanks was backing up. If it breached, it would flood 3 decks with wastewater, including the deck that held the conference rooms where negotiations were supposed to start in 2 hours. Blake moved on autopilot, grabbed his tools, and ran. The valve was stuck closed, probably corroded from years of inadequate maintenance. He needed to get it open and then replace it, but first he had to isolate the tank pressure or the whole thing would explode when he removed the valve assembly. The isolation controls were manual, requiring someone to physically turn a series of wheels in sequence. Blake started the process, his still sore shoulders protesting every rotation. He was halfway through when he heard footsteps behind him. It was Kessa again, along with 2 other Krenthi warriors. She asked what the crisis was this time. Blake explained between wheel rotations that it was a water system failure, and that he needed to isolate this tank before he could repair the valve, but the controls required significant force and had to be done in the right sequence or the pressure differential would make things worse. Kessa studied the setup for a moment, then spoke to her companions in the Krenthi language. They nodded and took positions at different wheels. She told Blake to direct them and that they would provide the force needed. Blake blinked in surprise, then recovered. He called out the sequence, and the Krenthi warriors turned the wheels with ease, their strength making the job that had been exhausting for Blake look simple. In minutes, they had the tank isolated. Blake got to work on the valve replacement. Kessa watched, occasionally handing him tools when he needed them, somehow knowing which one he wanted before he asked. The other 2 warriors stood guard, though what they were guarding against in a maintenance tunnel, Blake was not sure. As he worked, Blake asked what had brought them to this section of the station at this hour. Kessa explained that she had been thinking about what Blake had said about interconnected systems, and had decided that the Krenthi should understand the station better, So she was conducting what humans might call a patrol, learning the corridors and critical systems. Then she added that it was fortunate they were nearby when this crisis occurred. Blake agreed it was fortunate and thanked her for the help. She replied that it was proper behavior, that pack members assist each other with challenges, and while Blake was not Crenthi, he had proven himself worthy of such assistance. The valve replacement completed, Blake restored the system pressure gradually, monitoring for leaks. Everything held. The water reclamation was back online, crisis averted. Kessa asked how often Blake had to perform such emergency repairs. Blake admitted that since he was the only maintenance technician on the station, pretty much every day brought some kind of crisis, and that he had been running on minimal sleep for months. But that was just how it was on understaffed stations on the frontier. Kessa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that sounded like a growl, but that Blake was learning indicated deep thought. She stated that this was not acceptable, that a station this size should have proper support, and that allowing one person to carry such burden was poor resource management at best and cruelty at worst. Blake shrugged. He said the coalition had budget issues and staffing shortages, and that frontier stations were low priority, and that he had signed up for the job knowing it would be hard. Kessa made that growling thinking sound again, but did not respond further. They made it back to the main level just as the morning shift began, such as it was. The negotiations were scheduled to start in an hour. Blake desperately wanted a shower and food, but he settled for washing his hands and face in a maintenance room sink and eating the last sandwich he had made the day before. It was a bit stale, but still edible. He was about to head back to his quarters when Orcs found him. The administrator was even more agitated than usual, his head crests vibrating with stress. Commander Orcs stated that they had a serious problem, that the coalition delegates had requested a particular temperature range for the negotiation room, and the Crenthi had requested a different range, and the room's environmental controls could not accommodate both without creating uncomfortable gradients. And could Blake fix it? Blake looked at his datapad, at the room in question, at the environmental specifications. The problem was not the controls. The problem was that the room was too small and the air circulation was not designed for precise zoning. He told Orcs that he could not fix it, not in an hour, and maybe not at all without major renovations. The administrator looked like he might faint. Blake thought for a moment, then asked if they could use a different room. Orcs said all the other suitable rooms were being used for various delegation functions. Blake asked what about the cargo bay on Deck 3, the one that was currently empty. The administrator blinked. He said that was not a proper conference room, that it was just an empty space. Blake pointed out that empty spaces had advantages, like size for proper environmental zoning and flexibility for setup, and maybe it would not be traditional, but it would actually work. Orcs considered this, his head crests slowing their vibration. He said it was irregular, but that he supposed irregularity was better than complete failure, and that he would propose it to both delegations. An hour later, Blake found himself in Cargo Bay 3, helping set up tables and chairs while both delegations looked on with varying degrees of skepticism. The coalition delegates clearly thought this was beneath the dignity of such important negotiations. The Crenthi, on the other hand, seemed almost amused. The pack leader, whose name Blake learned was Nerith, approached him while he was adjusting the environmental zone settings. She asked if Blake was the human mechanic who had prevented multiple station failures in the past day. Blake confirmed he was, and apologized for the unconventional meeting space, but explained the environmental limitations of the traditional conference rooms. Nerith made a sound that was definitely a laugh. She said that the Crenthi appreciated practical solutions over ceremonial nonsense, and that a space that functioned properly was far superior to a prestigious space that did not, and that she was beginning to understand why humans had such an unusual reputation in the galaxy. Blake was not sure how to respond to that, so he just nodded and continued his work. The negotiations began, and Blake excused himself. He had more repairs to handle, and watching diplomats talk was not his area of expertise. He spent the rest of the day working through his maintenance checklist, fixing things that had been broken for weeks, finally having time to do proper repairs instead of just emergency patches. Late in the afternoon, alarms sounded again. This time it was not a system failure. It was a security alert. Blake's first thought was that the negotiations had gone wrong, that someone had started shooting, but when he checked his communicator, the message was different. There was an unidentified ship approaching the station, not responding to hails, and trajectory analysis suggested hostile intent. Blake rushed to the main operations center, where Orcs and several coalition security officers were staring at scanner displays with expressions of panic. The ship was small but fast, and it was armed. Chief Mordax was barking orders, trying to coordinate a defense with the station's minimal weapons systems, which had not been properly maintained in years and which Blake had not had time to check. Blake asked what was happening. The Kortathi security chief explained that it appeared to be a pirate vessel, probably hoping to take advantage of the station's current high-value occupants, and that their weapon systems were only partially operational, and that they had maybe 5 minutes before the ship was in firing range. Blake pulled up the weapons system diagnostics on a spare console. What he saw made his heart sink. The targeting systems were completely offline, the power feeds were barely functional, and the main plasma cannon had a fault in its magnetic containment that meant it would probably explode if they tried to fire it. He told Chief Mordax that they could not use the weapons, that attempting to fire would likely destroy the station faster than the pirates could. The security chief's scales went pale. He asked what they should do then. Before Blake could answer, the door to operations opened and Nerith strode in, followed by Kessa and the other honor guard members. The pack leader asked what the situation was, her tone commanding immediate answers. Chief Mordax explained about the pirate ship, the non-functional weapons, the approaching threat. Nerith listened, then asked a simple question. She asked where the pirates would dock if they intended to board. Blake brought up the station schematic and highlighted the most likely access points, the airlocks that would be easiest to breach. Nerith studied the display, then spoke to her honor guard in their own language. They responded with what sounded like eager affirmatives. She turned back to the coalition officers and stated that the Krenthi would handle the borders, that this was a situation that required warriors, and that they should focus on protecting the delegates and non-combatants. Chief Mordax looked like he wanted to argue, but clearly thought better of it. He nodded and started organizing the evacuation of non-essential personnel. Blake started to leave with the others, but Kessa stopped him. She said that Blake knew the station better than anyone, and that his knowledge of access routes and system controls could be valuable in a fight. Blake pointed out that he was not a fighter. Kessa replied that he did not need to be, that he needed to be what he was, someone who understood how things worked, and that she suspected that would be more useful than another set of claws. So Blake found himself following the Krenthi honor guard through the station's corridors, his mind racing through possibilities. The pirates would try to breach through Airlock 7. He was almost certain. It was the oldest, the easiest to override, and the closest to the command center. He told Kessa his analysis. She agreed and positioned her warriors accordingly. Then Blake had an idea. It was crazy, probably dangerous, and definitely not in any maintenance manual, but it might work. He asked Kessa if she could give him 2 minutes before the pirates breached. She looked at him with those intense eyes and asked what he planned to do. Blake explained that Airlock 7 had a safety feature, a pressure equalization system that could be manually overridden, and that if he disabled the safeties and adjusted the atmospheric pressure in the lock chamber, he could create conditions that would be very uncomfortable for whoever was inside. Kessa's expression changed to something that might have been respect. She said that causing discomfort to enemies before battle was a sound tactical approach, and that she would ensure Blake had his 2 minutes. Blake ran to the nearest maintenance access and pulled up the airlock control systems. The safety overrides were designed to prevent exactly what he was planning, but they were also designed to be accessible to maintenance personnel who knew what they were doing. He worked fast, disabling safeties, rerouting pressure controls, setting up a program that would trigger when the outer airlock door opened. It was sloppy code, written in a hurry, but it should work. 1 minute 50 seconds. He confirmed the programming and ran back to where Kessa waited. She asked if it was done. Blake said it was, and that when the pirates opened the outer door, they would get a surprise. 30 seconds later, the station's sensors registered the airlock breach. The outer door was forced open, and Blake's program triggered. The airlock chamber flooded with atmosphere at 3 times normal pressure, followed immediately by a rapid decompression to half normal pressure, then back to triple pressure. The cycling repeated every 5 seconds, creating a pressure differential that would make anyone inside feel like their ears and sinuses were exploding, make breathing difficult, and generally turned the simple act of moving through the airlock into an agonizing experience. The pirates stumbled out of the airlock, disoriented and in pain, directly into the waiting Krenthi honor guard. The fight was brief and brutal. The Krenthi moved with coordinated precision, disarming and incapacitating the boarders in seconds. It was like watching a demonstration of overwhelming superiority, a reminder of why the Krenthi had fought the entire coalition to a standstill. When it was over, 12 pirates lay unconscious or groaning on the deck, and not a single Krenthi had taken a serious injury. Nerith herself had come to observe the resolution. She looked at the disabled pirates, then at the still cycling airlock, then at Blake. She asked if Blake had created the pressure trap. Blake confirmed he had, explaining that it was just a modification of the safety systems, and that he would need to reset everything once they had the pirates secured. Nerith made a sound that was definitely approval. She stated that using the environment itself as a weapon showed proper tactical thinking, and that Blake had the mind of a warrior even if he did not have the body for direct combat. Blake was not sure if that was a compliment, but Kessa seemed pleased, so he took it as one. The coalition security forces arrived and took custody of the pirates. Chief Mordax approached Blake with an expression that mixed gratitude and disbelief. The security chief said that was brilliant and asked where Blake had learned such tactics. Blake shrugged and said he had just thought about what tools he had available and how to use them, and that really it was just applied maintenance knowledge. Chief Mordax shook his head slowly and muttered something about humans being unfairly versatile. With the immediate crisis resolved, Blake reset the airlock safeties and made sure the systems were back to normal operation. The pirate ship, it turned out, had fled when their boarding party stopped reporting in. The coalition was sending a patrol to track them down, but that was someone else's problem now. Blake made his way back to the cargo bay where negotiations had apparently continued through the entire incident. The delegates seemed unaware that anything unusual had happened, which Blake supposed was a sign that the crisis response had worked. He was about to leave when Nerith called to him. The pack leader approached with Kessa at her side. Nerith stated that the Krenthi had been observing Blake since their arrival, and that they had discussed him among themselves, and that they had reached a conclusion they wished to share. Blake waited, uncertain what to expect. The pack leader explained that the Krenthi had come to these negotiations with certain expectations about the coalition, most of them negative based on past experiences, but that Blake had challenged their assumptions, and that watching one individual maintain an entire station through knowledge and determination had shown them something important about the species that made up the coalition. She continued, saying that the Krenthi valued strength, but that they had learned through centuries of warfare that strength took many forms, and that the ability to maintain, to repair, to keep systems and people functioning under adverse conditions was a strength that deserved recognition. Blake did not know what to say. He managed to thank her for the kind words. Nerith was not finished. She stated that the negotiations were proceeding well, better than expected, and that the Krenthi had decided to propose something unprecedented in the final agreement, a cultural exchange program that would place Krenthi observers with various coalition species to learn their different forms of strength. She added that she would be requesting that the first such observer be placed here, on Frontier Station 7, to learn from Blake how humans maintained complex systems with limited resources, as this was a skill the Krenthi fleet could benefit from greatly. Blake blinked. He asked if she meant someone would come to watch him fix air conditioners and power couplings. Nerith replied that yes, essentially, and that the Krenthi did not view such work as beneath warriors, but rather as a different form of battle, one against entropy and system failure rather than against enemies. Kessa added that she had volunteered for this assignment, as she found Blake's approach to problem-solving fascinating and believed she could learn much. Blake looked at these towering warriors who could tear apart armed pirates with ease, who represented one of the most feared military forces in the galaxy, and who apparently wanted to learn maintenance procedures from a chronically sleep-deprived mechanic on an understaffed frontier station. He said that if they were serious, he would be happy to teach them, but that they should know most of the work was tedious, dirty, and involved a lot of crawling through tight spaces. Kessa made that laughing sound and replied that Krenthi training involved far worse conditions, and that she was not afraid of tight spaces or dirt. The negotiations concluded successfully 2 days later. The treaty was signed, establishing trade routes and cultural exchanges and a framework for peaceful coexistence that many had thought impossible. The coalition delegates congratulated themselves on their diplomatic skills. The Krenthi acknowledged that productive dialogue was possible when participants acted with honor. Blake spent those 2 days doing what he always did, keeping the station running. But now he had help. Kessa had immediately begun following him on his maintenance rounds, asking questions, learning the systems, and providing her considerable strength for the tasks that required it. He taught her about power distribution, environmental controls, structural integrity monitoring, and a dozen other systems that kept the station alive. She absorbed the information with an intensity that reminded Blake of military briefings, treating each lesson like vital intelligence. On the final day, as the delegations prepared to depart, Orcs found Blake in one of the maintenance tunnels. The administrator said that he had received word from Coalition Command that they were sending additional maintenance staff to the station, that Blake's reports of operating alone had apparently been escalated during the summit, and that the Krenthi pack leader had personally messaged the coalition leadership about the unacceptable conditions on Frontier 7. Blake was stunned. He asked if Nerith had really done that. Orcs confirmed she had, and that her message had been. The administrator consulted his datapad, blunt and unflattering regarding the coalition's resource allocation priorities, and that apparently when a Krenthi pack leader makes a formal complaint, people listen. Blake felt something warm in his chest that might have been gratitude or might have been the realization that he would not be alone anymore. The delegations departed. The coalition ships left first, the diplomats pleased with their success. The Krenthi followed, their warship as intimidating leaving as it had been arriving. But Kessa stayed. She had officially been assigned as the first Krenthi observer, with authorization to remain on Frontier 7 for a minimum of 6 months to study human maintenance and engineering practices. Blake showed her to the quarters that had been hastily prepared, much larger than his own small room, but still modest by any standard. She looked around the space and stated it was adequate, then asked when they would resume training. Blake laughed and said they could start tomorrow, that today he was going to sleep for 12 hours and eat a real meal, and that she should rest too. Kessa replied that Krenthi required less sleep than humans, and that she had been researching human food preparation and was interested in learning about this concept of sandwiches. Blake stared at her. He asked if she meant she wanted to learn how to make sandwiches. She confirmed this, explaining that she had observed Blake eating them during crisis situations, and that any food that could be consumed while responding to emergencies seemed tactically valuable. So Blake found himself in his tiny quarters, teaching an 8-foot-tall Krenthi warrior how to make a sandwich. He showed her the bread, the various ingredients, the layering technique, the importance of not overfilling or the whole thing falls apart. Kessa listened with the same intense focus she brought to learning about power systems. She asked about optimal meat to vegetable ratios, the structural integrity of different bread types, and whether there were formal protocols for condiment application. Blake assured her there were no formal protocols, that sandwiches were about personal preference and using what you had available. She considered this, then stated that this flexibility and adaptability, even in food preparation, seemed very human, and that she was beginning to understand why humans were successful despite often lacking the physical advantages of other species. They made sandwiches together. Blake used his usual ingredients. Kessa experimented with combinations that seemed random to Blake, but that she insisted were based on Krenthi flavor profiles. The result looked strange, but she seemed satisfied. They ate in comfortable silence, sitting in Blake's small quarters, an exhausted human mechanic and a Krenthi honor guard, sharing a meal after preventing a war and surviving a pirate attack, and keeping a station running through sheer determination. Kessa broke the silence. She said that her pack leader had been correct, that strength took many forms, and that she was honored to learn from Blake. Blake replied that he was just doing his job, and that anyone could do it with the right training. Kessa disagreed. She said that many could learn the technical skills, but that what Blake had demonstrated went beyond technical knowledge, and that it was the combination of knowledge, persistence, creativity under pressure, and the willingness to help others even at personal cost that made him remarkable. Blake felt his face heat up. He was not good with compliments, especially ones that serious. He changed the subject. asking Kessa about Krenthi engineering practices, genuinely curious about how their ships maintained such reliability despite their aggressive designs. She brightened at the question and began explaining Krenthi maintenance philosophies, which turned out to involve a lot of redundancy and a cultural emphasis on taking care of one's tools and equipment that bordered on spiritual. They talked for hours, trading knowledge, comparing approaches, finding unexpected common ground between human improvisation and Krenthi dedication to proper maintenance. The next morning, the first of the new maintenance staff arrived. 3 technicians, sent by Coalition Command with apologies for the previous understaffing and assurances that Frontier 7 would now have proper support. Blake spent the day showing them the station systems, introducing them to his patchwork of repairs and workarounds, explaining which things were critical and which could wait. They looked at him with a mix of respect and disbelief when they realized he had been maintaining everything alone. One of them, a Velthrin named Orcs, asked how Blake had survived without going insane. Blake shrugged and said you just did what needed doing, one task at a time. Orcs shook his head and said that humans were either crazy or blessed, and he was not sure which. Kessa, who had been observing the training, stated that humans were neither crazy nor blessed, but rather possessed a particular form of practical stubbornness that served them well in adverse conditions. The new technicians stared at the Krenthi warrior. Blake introduced her and explained the observer program. They looked even more confused, but nodded and accepted it. This was a frontier station. Weird things happened. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Blake and his new team maintained the station, which was much easier with proper staffing. Kessa learned everything she could, asking endless questions, taking detailed notes, and occasionally offering insights from Krenthi practices that actually improved their procedures. Word of the unusual partnership spread through Coalition space. Other species began requesting Krenthi observers. The cultural exchange program expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations. Blake received a commendation from Coalition Command, official recognition for his role in maintaining the station during the summit and preventing the pirate attack. He filed it away and went back to work. 6 months passed quickly. Kessa's assignment was officially complete. The Krenthi sent a ship to retrieve her, but she requested and received an extension. She told Blake that she had not yet learned everything she wanted to learn, and that her reports back to the pack had generated significant interest in human engineering approaches. Blake asked what she had told them. She explained that she had reported on human ability to maintain complex systems with minimal resources, on the creative problem-solving humans employed when proper solutions were not available, on the tendency of humans to help others even when not required to do so, and on the peculiar human practice of making food that could be eaten during crisis situations. Blake laughed and said that she had basically written a report about his sandwich-making skills. Kessa replied seriously that the sandwiches were relevant, that the ability to maintain basic needs like nutrition even during high-stress situations was important for sustained operations, and that the Krenthi fleet had actually begun implementing similar practices after reading her reports. Blake blinked. He asked if she meant the Krenthi military was now eating sandwiches. She confirmed this, adding that the concept of portable, customizable nutrition had been well received, and that several pack leaders had sent requests for more information on optimal sandwich construction techniques. Blake started laughing and could not stop. The image of fierce Krenthi warriors carefully assembling sandwiches according to tactical nutrition guidelines was too absurd and too wonderful. Kessa watched him laugh, her expression fond. She said that this was very human too, finding humor in unexpected places, and that it was one of the things she had come to appreciate most about his species. A year after the summit, Frontier Station 7 had transformed. Properly staffed, well-maintained, it had become a hub for coalition and Krenthi cooperation. More observers came, from both sides, learning from each other, building relationships that would have been impossible before. Blake trained them all, human and alien alike, sharing his knowledge freely. He taught Krenthi about improvisation, Velthrans about persistence, Kortathi about creative problem-solving. And he learned from them too, incorporating their techniques, their perspectives, their different approaches to the same problems. The station commander position changed. Orcs was promoted to a position at Coalition headquarters, replaced by a human administrator named Sarah Morgan, who actually understood maintenance requirements and who made sure the station got the resources it needed. Blake met with her on her first day. She reviewed his records, his repair logs, his reports from the year of solo operation. She asked how he had managed without completely burning out. Blake thought about it. He said that someone had to do it, and that the work mattered, and that when you break it down to individual tasks instead of looking at the overwhelming whole, most things are manageable. Sarah smiled and said that was the most human answer she had ever heard, and that it was exactly why she had requested this assignment, to work with someone who understood that philosophy. She added that Coalition Command had been impressed enough with the results on Frontier 7 that they were implementing similar observer programs across the frontier, and that Blake's approach to maintenance and cooperation had become something of a model. Blake did not know how to feel about that. He had just been trying to keep the air conditioning running. 2 years after the summit, Nerith returned to Frontier 7. She was leading a Krenthi delegation to formalize expanded cooperation agreements, but she made time to meet with Blake privately. She told him that the cultural exchange he had helped start had changed Krenthi society in ways she had not anticipated, that exposure to human persistence and creativity had influenced everything from military tactics to civilian infrastructure management, and that the Krenthi owed him a debt. Blake protested that he had just done his job, and that Kessa had done all the real work of bringing the knowledge back to her people. Nerith made an amused sound. She said that Kessa had indeed been an excellent observer, and that her reports had been invaluable, but that without Blake's willingness to teach, to share, to treat a warrior of a former enemy species as a student and friend, none of it would have been possible. She continued, stating that the Krenthi had spent centuries believing that strength meant dominance, that power meant victory in battle, but that humans had shown them a different path, and that the strength to maintain, to repair, to help others succeed was just as worthy as the strength to fight. Blake felt tears prick his eyes. He had not realized how much he needed to hear that his work mattered, that the endless repairs and late nights and skipped meals had meant something beyond just keeping systems running. Nerith placed a massive hand on his shoulder, gentle despite the obvious strength behind it. She said that Blake had prevented a war not through weapons or diplomacy, but by being competent, dedicated, and kind, and that the galaxy was better for it. As she left, Blake stood in the maintenance bay where this had all started, surrounded by humming equipment and blinking status lights. His team was scattered throughout the station, handling their assigned tasks. Kessa was training a new batch of observers in proper diagnostic procedures. The station ran smoothly, efficiently, the way it was supposed to. Blake pulled out his datapad and checked the maintenance schedule. There was always more work to do, more systems to check, more repairs to make. But now he did not face it alone. He smiled, grabbed his tool bag, and headed for the next task on his list. Somewhere in the station, an alarm would probably sound soon. Some system would fail in an unexpected way, and he would have to figure out how to fix it with whatever tools and materials he had available. That was the job. That was what he did. And maybe, just maybe, that was its own kind of strength. The pack had brought their fiercest warriors. Blake had brought sandwiches. And somehow, in the weird logic of the universe, that had been exactly right. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.